What if almost everything you were taught about ancient history was a lie? Not a small lie, not a simple mistake, but the biggest, most convenient lie ever told. We are all taught a simple, linear story. Humanity begins as primitive hunter-gatherers. We discover farming. We build small villages. Those villages become cities. We invent writing. We build temples. And then, finally, we become us. Civilized. Modern. The pinnacle. It's a clean story. A safe story. And it has one very convenient rule. Anything that doesn't fit this timeline, anything that breaks this simple, straight line of progress, is dismissed. It's labeled with a single, powerful word: myth. The lost city of Atlantis? A myth. A global, world-ending flood? A myth. Stories of giants, of advanced technologies, of wars in the heavens? Myths. 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 They are dismissed as fairy tales. The fantasies of primitive minds. But here at 0 Point Lore, we believe this is the greatest deception of all. We believe the word myth is not a synonym for fiction. It is a synonym for memory. Myth is a data storage system. It is a compressed file, a fragmented report of a real event, encoded into stories and symbols so that it might survive the collapse of civilizations. For centuries, academics and historians laughed at these stories. They sat in their offices and wrote books about what was impossible. But a very few, obsessive, stubborn, and relentlessly curious individuals refused to listen. They were ridiculed. Their careers were threatened. But they believed the myths were not just stories. They believed the myths were maps. They traded their books for shovels. And they started to dig. This is the story of 5 myths that were laughed out of the history books by the experts, only to be proven terrifyingly, indisputably real by archaeology. What they found doesn't just add a new chapter to our history, it forces us to tear the entire book apart. For over 2,000 years, one story stood as the cornerstone of Western literature: Homer's Iliad, the tale of a 10-year war. A conflict sparked by the abduction of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. A war of heroes like Achilles and Hector. A war of gods like Zeus and Apollo, interfering in the affairs of men. A war that ended with a clever trick. A giant, hollow, wooden horse. The story of the Trojan War. It is an epic masterpiece. A story of passion, honor, and tragedy. And for millennia, that's all it was allowed to be. A story. By the 19th century, the academic consensus was final. Homer was a poet, not a historian. There was no Trojan War. There was no Helen. And there was no city of Troy. It was all a grand, symbolic fiction, but one man disagreed. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. He was not a professor. He was not an archaeologist. He was a wealthy German businessman, and he had been obsessed with the Iliad since he was a child. While the academics read the Iliad as poetry, Schliemann read it as a guidebook, a treasure map. He believed that every location Homer described was real. He was mocked, of course. He was called a dreamer, a fool, an amateur who didn't understand literature. But Schliemann had something the academics didn't: millions of dollars, and a singular, burning obsession. He followed the geographical clues in the text, the distance from the sea, the proximity to 2 rivers, and he arrived at a hill in modern-day Turkey called Hisarlik. In 1871, he began to dig, and dig is perhaps too gentle a word. Schliemann was a man of the 19th century. He was brutal. Visual. An old photo of Schliemann's Great Trench. It's a massive, crude gash in the earth. He didn't just dig. He used dynamite. He blasted his way down through history, destroying layer after layer, desperate to find the city of his dreams. And then, he found it. He found gold. thousands of pieces of gold. He called it Priam's treasure, smuggling it out of the country, declaring to the world, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. I have found Troy." The academics were furious. They analyzed the treasure, the pottery, the walls Schliemann had found, and they delivered a crushing verdict. This is not Troy. The treasure he found, they proved, was from a civilization 1,000 years older than the supposed Trojan War. The city he found was the wrong city. He had dug too deep, too fast. Heinrich Schliemann died in 1890, considered a failure by many. The myth remained a myth until decades later, after Schliemann had died. New generations of archaeologists, more careful, more scientific, returned to his Great Trench. They began to study the other layers he had damaged. Layer upon layer, 9 cities in total, built one on top of the other. And they focused on one layer in particular, a layer known as Troy 7A. And there, they found the proof. They found evidence of a catastrophic fire. They found skeletons left in the streets. They found piles of sling bullets and bronze arrowheads embedded in the remaining walls. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was a war. A brutal, final siege. And when they carbon dated this layer, the date came back. Approximately 1250 B.C., the exact historical time frame the ancient Greeks had always claimed for the Trojan War. Schliemann, the obsessed amateur, had been right all along. He had just dug right past it. The myth was real. The war was real. The city was real. Homer was a historian. This discovery sent a shockwave through history. It proved that a story dismissed as fantasy for 2,000 years was, in fact, a historical report. It opened a terrifying new question. If Troy was real, what else was? Finding a city on land is one thing. But what about a myth that describes crossing the deadliest ocean on Earth, 500 years before the supposed Age of Discovery? We all know the other official story. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered the New World. For 500 years, this was history. But in the frozen north, in Iceland, a different story was told. A story that was much, much older. They were called the Norse sagas, and they told, in remarkably practical detail, of voyages west of Greenland. They described a man named Leif Erikson, who, around the year 1000 AD, discovered a new land. They described the land in stages: Helluland, or Land of Flat Stones; Markland, or Land of Forests; and finally, a place they called Vinland, the land of wine. To academics, this was, once again, nothing more than a myth, a folktale, a story Vikings told themselves around the fire. Their reasoning was simple. First, the boats. Visual: a diagram of a longship. These were open-decked, wooden boats. The idea of them crossing the notoriously violent North Atlantic was considered impossible. Second, the description. Vinland, a land of wine? In Canada? It was absurd. The sagas were fantasy. Columbus was first. The case was closed, until they came along. Helga and Anne-Steen Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer and his archaeologist wife. Like Schliemann, they were obsessed. And like Schliemann, they were convinced the myth was a manual. They didn't read the sagas as literature. They read them as sailing directions. They hypothesized that Helluland was Baffin Island. Markland was the coast of Labrador. And Vinland must be just south of there. For years in the early 1960s, they searched. They flew in small planes. They sailed in small boats, meticulously scanning the coastline of Newfoundland, Canada. They were looking for anything that didn't fit the landscape. In 1961, a local fisherman in the tiny village of Lanceau Meadows showed Helge some strange, overgrown mounds near the water. The locals assumed they were an old Indian camp. The moment Anne Stein Ingstad, the archaeologist, saw them, she knew. They were not random mounds. They were the perfectly straight, rectangular outlines of Norse sod longhouses, identical in every way to those she had excavated in Greenland and Iceland. The team began to dig. They found artifacts of daily life, a soapstone spindle, a bone needle, clear evidence of a Norse settlement. But the skeptics still argued. It could be a seasonal camp, they said. It could be from later Basque fishermen. They needed one final, undeniable piece of proof. And then they found it. They found a forge, a blacksmith's workshop. And in it, they found slag and several forged iron nails. The indigenous peoples of North America, the Beothuk and Inuit, were Stone Age cultures. They did not forge iron. The Vikings did. When the carbon dating came back, it was the final word. The site was dated to between 990 and 1050 AD. 500 years before Columbus, the myth was real. The sagas were sailing charts. The Vikings had reached America. Lanceau Meadows is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The myth is now accepted history, and it proves, once again, that the ancient world was far more connected and far more capable than we were ever taught. The oceans were not barriers. They were highways. Crossing an ocean and building a hut is one thing, but what about a myth of an entire city? A metropolis, vanishing in a single night, swallowed whole by the wrath of the gods. We all know the myth of Atlantis, Plato's story of a proud, advanced island civilization that, in one terrible day and night, was consumed by earthquakes and floods, vanishing beneath the sea. For millennia, this has been the ultimate myth, the benchmark for a cautionary tale, a philosophical fable. Academics have long dismissed it. Where is the evidence? Where is one city that has vanished this way? They argued that Plato invented Atlantis as a warning against hubris, against arrogance, and they pointed to the likely source of his inspiration, another myth. The story of Helike. In the ancient world, Helike was not a myth. It was a real place, a powerful, wealthy city-state. It was the capital of the Achaean League, and, most importantly, it was the sacred center for the worship of Poseidon, the god of the sea and earthquakes. And then, in the winter of 373 B.C., it vanished. Ancient writers like Pausanias and Strabo wrote about it. They said a colossal earthquake struck. The ground liquefied. And then, a tsunami rolled in from the Gulf of Corinth and swallowed the entire city. When the sun rose, Helike was gone. For centuries, travelers reported sailing over the spot, claiming they could see the submerged ruins, the statues of Poseidon, through the water. But as time passed, the location was lost. The myth grew. By the 20th century, academics dismissed the story. It was just too dramatic. A city swallowed in one night? It had to be an exaggeration. A moral fable. Style, sarcastic. The city that worshipped the earthquake. God was destroyed by an earthquake. How convenient. It was a myth. Probably the inspiration for the other myth, Atlantis. But two people refused to believe it was impossible. Archaeologist Elpida Hajidaki and her husband, physicist Stephen Soter. They began the search for Helike in 1988, but they had a problem. Everyone before them had been searching in the sea, and they found nothing. Soter, the physicist, had a radical new theory. What if the city wasn't in the Gulf? What if the earthquake created a coastal lagoon, and the tsunami buried the city underneath that lagoon? And what if, over 2,000 years, that lagoon had dried up, silting over, leaving the ruins, not in the ocean, but buried deep on dry land? He was telling them to look for a sunken city, miles from the current coastline. He was ridiculed. It was junk science, but they persisted. For 12 years they searched, drilling boreholes into the coastal plain. Visual: a drill auger pulling up mud, core sample after core sample. Mile after mile. Mud, silt, clay. Nothing. Until the summer of 2001. The drill hit something hard. They pulled up the core sample. It wasn't mud. It was a piece of a roof tile. They dug, and they found it. Not just a tile, not just a wall. An entire city, streets, buildings, houses, coins, pottery, all perfectly preserved in the oxygen-free, wet clay. And the dating? Classical Greek. The exact period of 373 B.C. And the final, chilling proof? The layer directly on top of the ruined city walls was not topsoil. It was a thick, black layer of marine sediment, silt, sand, and the microscopic fossils of sea creatures. It was the smoking gun. A city on land, instantly buried by a tsunami. Helike was real. The myth was a factual, eyewitness report, and its discovery is perhaps the most terrifying of all. Because if Helike is real, it means the mechanism that destroyed Plato's Atlantis is real. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that our planet can, and does, wipe entire civilizations off the map in a single night. Helike proves a city can be lost to a cataclysm. But what about a myth of an entire nation, a land of the gods, that was found not by digging, but by analyzing the tooth of a mummified baboon? The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were masters of propaganda. They carved their victories in stone, exaggerating their power, claiming to be gods on earth. One of the most famous examples comes from Queen Hatshepsut, around 1470 BC. She commissioned a massive series of carvings at her temple, detailing her greatest achievement: a grand expedition by sea to a mysterious, glorious place. A place she called Punt. The reliefs describe Punt as God's land, a place of immense wealth, from which her ships returned, laden with gold, ivory, exotic animals, and, most importantly, incense. Myrrh trees, still in their pots. For centuries, historians were stumped. Where was Punt? The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. But for Punt, they were vague. Was it propaganda? A fantasy land Hatshepsut invented to legitimize her reign as a female pharaoh? Scholars argued for decades. Some said Punt was in Arabia. Some said Somalia. Some said it was just a mythical representation of trade itself. The trail went cold for a century. The myth of Punt remained a beautiful piece of propaganda. The breakthrough came not from a trench, but from a museum drawer. And not from a human, but from a baboon. Archaeologists had long known that Egyptians imported baboons, which were sacred to the god Thoth. And several mummified baboons, found in tombs, were specifically labeled as originating from Punt. For a long time, this didn't help. It just confirmed baboons came from somewhere. But then, in the 21st century, scientists developed a revolutionary new tool: isotope analysis. The principle is simple. You are what you eat, and you are what you drink. The chemical elements in the water and plants you consume, strontium, oxygen, leave a permanent, unique fingerprint in your bones and teeth as you grow. This fingerprint, this isotope signature, is tied directly to the specific geology of the region where you grew up. Scientists from Dartmouth College took tiny samples from the hair and tooth enamel of these mummified baboons. They were, quite literally, about to read a map hidden in the teeth of a mummy. They analyzed the isotope signature, and they ran a comparison. First, the signature did not match Egypt. This proved the baboons were imported. Second, it did not match Somalia or Saudi Arabia, the most popular theories. The signature did match, perfectly. A very specific, isolated region on the Horn of Africa, modern-day Eritrea and eastern Sudan. They had found it. They had pinpointed the mythical land of Punt. Hatshepsut's propaganda was not propaganda. It was a documentary. This discovery, confirmed just in the last decade, is profound. It proves that the ancient world was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. It proves that 3,500 years ago, the Egyptians were conducting massive, sophisticated, long-distance maritime trade operations, sailing thousands of miles into the open ocean. Once again, the myth was just a historical fact. We were too arrogant and too primitive in our own science to understand. We've found a city, a continent, a kingdom. But what about the greatest myth of all? The myth created by historians themselves. The myth that we are the first great advanced civilization. What if the evidence proved that was the biggest lie? This is the most important story, because this myth wasn't told by ancient Greeks or Vikings. It was told by us, by modern historians, by the textbooks you read in school. And that myth is the Neolithic Revolution. The story is simple. For millions of years, humans were primitive hunter-gatherers. They were nomads, living hand-to-mouth, too busy surviving to build anything more than a mud hut. Then, around 10,000 B.C., we invent agriculture. Farming creates surplus food. Surplus food allows people to settle down. This creates villages. Villages lead to cities. Cities lead to complex society, organized religion, and, finally, monumental architecture. This is the story of progress. This is the foundation of our entire world. Anyone suggesting that hunter-gatherers, cavemen, could build massive, complex structures was not just wrong, they were a fool. It was an impossibility. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was working in southern Turkey. He came across a strange, rounded hill. The locals called it Göbekli Tepe, which means Potbelly Hill. It didn't look like much. But Schmidt noticed something. The entire hill was covered in flint chips. Thousands, millions of them. He knew this was not a natural hill. He knew that primitive people would not waste this much precious flint in one place, unless it was a workshop. He began to dig. He did not find a village. He did not find houses. He did not find a single cooking pot. He found a cathedral, a complex of massive, circular enclosures. At the center of each, two colossal, T-shaped pillars, weighing over 20 tons apiece. They were not crude. They were art. They were covered in intricate, sophisticated carvings of animals, foxes, boars, cranes, and terrifying predators. It was the most sophisticated, complex, megalithic site ever discovered. And then came the dating. Klaus Schmidt and his team carbon dated the site. The results came back. 11,600 years old. This is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. This is 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is the oldest temple, the oldest megalithic structure ever found on planet Earth. But that is not the part that broke history. The team searched for any sign of farming, any sign of settlement, any sign of domesticated grain. They found none. All they found were the bones of wild gazelles and other animals. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers. The myth of the Neolithic Revolution. The story that all of modern history is built upon was wrong. It wasn't farming, which led to villages. which led to temples. It was the exact opposite. The will to build this Vatican of the Stone Age. This massive, complex, religious center came first. The monumental effort of building Göbekli Tepe is what likely forced humanity to invent agriculture. They had to. They had to figure out how to feed the thousands of workers who gathered to build it. The myth of progress was told backwards. Human consciousness, complex society, and organized religion did not emerge from farming. Farming emerged from them. Troy, Vinland, Helic, Punt, Göbekli Tepe. These are not just isolated corrections to a textbook. They are data points in a terrifying new pattern. The pattern proves that our ancestors' myths are not fiction. They are memories. Damaged, fragmented, and encoded. But memories nonetheless. Memories of a world that was far more advanced, far more connected, and far more catastrophic than we have ever been willing to accept. It forces us to ask, what is the real myth? Is it the story of Atlantis? Or is the real myth the academic arrogance that insisted it was impossible? Is it the story of a global flood? Or is the real myth the comfortable, linear timeline that has no room for global cataclysms? The single greatest myth of all is the story of our own supremacy. The modern belief that we are the pinnacle, that we are the only civilization that matters. The truth is far more humbling. We are a species with amnesia, and we are just now, slowly, painfully, beginning to find the evidence of who we once were and what we have forgotten. If you believe that history is hiding more than it reveals, if you are tired of the official story and want to join the community that questions, then subscribe to 0 Point Lore. We are just getting started. The digging has only just begun. We've shown you 5 myths that turned out to be true. Now, we want to know what you think. What myth do you believe will be proven real next? Is it the lost city of Atlantis? The existence of Lemuria? A forgotten ancient technology? Let us know your theory in the comments below.